video, we will be interviewing Dr. Resil Mojares, Professor Emeritus at the University of San Carlos, where he was the founding director of the Cebuano Studies Center. He has also taught literature and history at the same university, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in literature. He completed his doctorate in literature at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. A noted writer, critic, and historian, he has published books on literary criticism and local and national history. He has won several National Book Awards, in addition to receiving Free Press and Palanca Prizes for his fiction. He has held several fellowships and been the recipient of grants from various universities and institutions abroad. In 2018, he was bestowed the honor of Philippine National Artist for Literature, thereby cementing his legacy as one of the country's most respected men of letters. Here is Dr. Resil Mojares.
Not so much like a point where I decided I was going to be a writer, but in a sense I discovered that it was something that I really enjoyed when I was in high school. And I so enjoyed it that I was like editor of the high school organ, and I could do a whole issue all by myself, from news stories and editorials to writing the poems and the feature stories. So it was I felt like it was something that kind of came naturally and so on. So that's I suppose, the first time I discovered the joy of writing. But the idea of taking it up as a full, you don't really take it up as a profession. Almost you start out with the sense that it's not really something that can be a source of employment or a job, but taking it up as a vocation probably came only when I was already in the university. I'm a war baby. I was born in 1943, so during the war. So I was born in a small town called Polanco, because that was where my parents had evacuated because of the war. Polanco is, I think, some 7 or 8 kilometers out of the capital of Zamboanga del Norte, which is now Dipolog city, but our place of residence was really Dipolog. So that was, in a way, where I grew up and lived until I finished high school and went off to the university. But even at that time, I was, in a sense, a student commuting between hometown and the university. So both my parents are Cebuanos, products of the great Cebuano migration to Mindanao. And so, of course, I in a sense, strong feelings about Mindanao, but I recall being invited some years back by Ateneo de Davao, and gave a talk on Mindanaoan writing, whether there's such a thing as, is there such a thing as Mindanaoan writing, and used as a jumping off point the fact that there was this, I think, a 2-volume anthology of Mindanao writing entitled Mindanao Harvest, which was published by the Iligan Institute of Technology, co-edited by Christine Ortega and Jaime and Lim. And it was interesting because they had a preface to the first volume where they struggled with the question as to who can be considered Mindanao writers. Do you take as your criterion the fact of place of birth, residence, and so on? So it opened up an interesting discussion of the problem, of course, of identification. Like, and Jaime Ann Lim, who wrote the preface, in fact, mentioned me in the preface, and he said, well, how about Resil Mojares, who was born in an obscure town in Zamboanga del Norte, but has since moved to Cebu, and he said, shall we include him in the volume? And said something to the effect that perhaps the Cebuanos would lynch us for claiming him as our writer. And so they never really kind of settled that issue. And I think the volume 2 had an introduction by Margie Vasco, and still that question. Anyway, kind of, it's an important, I think, literary problem, and Mindanao is an interesting case because you have I think, a concern among writers and intellectuals in Mindanao with respect to the creation of a Mindanaoan identity. I recall that kind of, the situation was when I was growing up, Mindanao in a sense was sharply divided along ethnic and religious lines. Like my parents were Cebuano migrants to Mindanao, really considered themselves Cebuanos. I mean, even the word Mindanaoan as yet, I think did not really exist at the time. And I recall that as a child, something that's kind of very much a part of my memory growing up was that every year the family would take what was then a rather kind of horribly inconvenient boat trip from Dipolog to from Dipolog you take a boat to Dumaguete, take a bus to a place called Tampi on the Negros side, and then cross by pump boat to the Cebu side, and from there take another short ride to Hinatilan, which is in southern Cebu and is the hometown of my mother, to attend the town fiesta. That seemed like an annual pilgrimage, which kind of illustrates, I think, very clearly that insofar as my mother, for instance, was concerned, I mean, that was kind of at the center of her world. I mean, not Dipolog or Mindanao, but her identification was with Cebu and her hometown in Cebu. And that was the nature of the almost like annual pilgrimage. So that kind of, it illustrates what as the kind of Cebuanos in Mindanao at the time identify themselves by ethnic origins rather than by place of residence. So it is only relatively recent that you have the rise of kind of a Mindanaoan identity. And I think this is true of succeeding generations who were no longer kind of identified so much with where they originally came from, but had learned to identify themselves with being of Mindanao and Mindanaoan, which I think is significant because, you know, given the problems of Mindanao, I mean, a sense of unity definitely cannot be established solely on the basis of religion or solely on the basis of ethnicity, because kind of Mindanao is a melting pot. I mean, there has to be like an overarching sense of being Mindanaoan in order so that people can feel that they belong to the same community. So it's no longer as divided as in the earlier times, in the time, for instance, of my parents, when their primary identification was being Ilonggo or Cebuano or Boholano, rather than being Mindanaoan. So Mindanaoan is a relatively kind of new identity, as it were. And that's why kind of today the rise of kind of, in a sense, Mindanaoan literature, for instance, kind of is interesting. It's interesting because kind of it shows how kind of identity formation in literature kind of is something that's dynamic and is developing. So your question as to kind of
identify Do you still
whether I
Zamboanga?
mean, kind of, I think not so much kind of, I mean, mostly kind of for sentimental kind of reasons. But, but that's kind of, I think, a familiar trajectory that people's lives take. Like, for instance, I don't go to Dipolog anymore because kind of my parents are not there anymore, probably kind of, I mean, I only have a brother who's left there, and kind of no ties. Unlike before when I'd go fairly regularly, there's kind of, in the same way that in the case of my mother, at one point in her life, towards the later years of her life, she never went back to Hinatilan in southern Cebu because she was too old to travel. It was kind of difficult, and also because she had learned to identify herself as being kind of Dipolognon rather than Cebuano. That's kind of, I mean, people's lives kind of change, and they take on kind of newer identities. But kind of the question of like kind of Mindanaoan writing, for instance, is something that interests me greatly, both for theoretical reasons and for reasons of kind of personal history. You know? So I think that's kind of one of the interesting things happening in Philippine literature today. Now, I lived in a sense, Dipolog up until I finished high school, and then went to study in Silliman University, where I had my first 2 years of university education. So Silliman, because Silliman had a very high reputation as a university at that time. And I suppose because my father finished high school there as a working student in the university cafeteria. And if you've been to Silliman University, I mean, the cafeteria is one place on campus where you get the feeling that, you know, this must have been still the same cafeteria when my father was here. Anyway, kind of. So I had my first 2 years at Silliman University, and then kind of decided to come to Cebu. I think I understand that the reason was it was still at that time when kind of people were conscious about kind of it's a Protestant university and you should not be sending your son there. So I think that's the reason my mother decided that I should kind of
Move here.
move to a Catholic university, and that meant coming to Cebu. But actually, my first experience of Cebu, which is something I don't quite recall anymore, after the war, probably around 1947, when the war was over, my parents decided to actually kind of explore the possibility of setting up residence here in Cebu. And so I had my kindergarten and grade 1 here in Cebu. But I think they decided to move back to Mindanao. And so that's where kind of I finished my grade school education. So, and then when I kind of transferred to San Carlos on my 3rd year of college, effectively, I took up residence in Cebu when I got married after I finished college. So, so that was when I became a Cebu City resident. And kind of my interest in, I think the founding of the Cebuano Studies Center in 1975 was what, in a sense, cemented my connection to Cebu, because kind of that was my work. So so I kind of became involved in the promotion of Cebuano studies from that point on. So 1975. And I got married 1971. No, the establishment of the Cebuano Studies Center was part of, I think, what you can correctly call the local studies movement at the end of the, kind of in a sense, is the end of the 1960s onwards. The scholar Vince Rafael has wrote an article on that period, and I think he used a very felicitous phrase for it, which I think, which I myself used since then, because it's a very convenient label. He speaks of the long 1970s, the long 1970s, by which he means the last years of the 1960s, the 1970s, and the early years of the 1980s. Because of course, like kind of historical movements cannot be bracketed by fixed years and so on. But in a sense, it's a definably kind of as a temporal, as a period. You know? Because like for instance, the end of the 1960s was the beginning of kind of the student movement, the re-establishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the country's descent into, in a sense, kind of political instability against the rise of anti-Americanism, which is a global phenomenon fueled mainly by the Vietnam War. You know, the late 60s was kind of an important period, not just in the Philippines, but actually worldwide, you know, kind of, and the end of the 1960s also marked a clear kind of intellectual shift in the Philippines. And in fact, in the case of literature, an important marker is, this is interesting, is part of of course, the rise of a new more radical militant form of nationalism involved, in a sense, the rejection of English as the colonial language. And that's why, like, kind of, Bien Lumbera, for instance, wrote an article in the Weekly Graphic, the graphic magazine, that I think 1969, must have been around 1969. And he had an article there where he said in the article, kind of, we are today witnessing the last generation of English writers. I mean, that was, in a sense, I think it was more as bravado than kind of, because as it turned out, of course, the prophecy did not quite materialize. But it did mark an important intellectual shift, because like Ninotchka Roska, for instance, kind of retired, she was no longer going to write in English, but would start writing in Tagalog. So there were indeed writers who kind of resolved that they were going to shift from English to the local language. And such was the deprivileging, as it were, of English, that, like, for instance, at the time, if, for instance, I would go to attend, probably give a talk or attend a conference in particularly UP, which of course was the Lions then or for nationalism, kind of, and not being able to give a talk in Tagalog, and it became almost like routine or customary at that time that if you're going to speak in English, you have to start out by apologizing for the fact that you're speaking in English, like kind of engage in a form of self-criticism by saying that kind of you're sorry, you have to, because those were highly polarized times. And so anyway, what I was about to say is the end of the 1960s was also the beginning of, in a sense, the rediscovery of the popular, the vernacular, the regional, in a sense, the local, the beginning of what, in retrospect, you can really call the local studies movement. So like in UP, for instance, kind of suddenly everybody was interested in in vernacular literature. So you had like all at the same time, Edna Zapanta Manlapas working on Kapampangan literature, Doreen Fernandez working on Iloilo Zarzuela, kind of Maria Lilia Realubit working on Bicol literature, and so on. That was the big thing in academe at the time. And you must remember that kind of universities prior to that time were not interested in vernacular or popular literature, you know. I mean, who would be studying comics or liwayway and so on? Because those are, libraries did not collect those materials because those were kind of, they said, low culture, not kind of, that was the beginning of a kind of, a vernacular movement. And so the establishment of the Cebuano Studies Center was part of that movement. And so like at the time, there was the Leyte Sama Research Library in Tacloban, there was the Dansalan Research Center in Marawi, the kind of West Visayan Studies program in Iloilo. So the local, regional studies, particularly in history and literature, were in a sense the kind of the interests of the time. So what led to the Cebuano Studies Center was, at that time, I had I think 3 graduate students under me who are all doing Cebuano literature. I mean, if you look back, like nobody, like you don't, like if you look at, for instance, the literature thesis prior to that time, they were all about American literature. It was only at that time that the really kind of, in a sense, very marked shift to the, in a sense, regional and local was, it was very, very pronounced. And so so I think what led to the Cebuano Studies Center was that I proposed to the university that I undertake a collections project because there were no Cebuano materials in the library. So in fact, that was the problem of the people who were writing their thesis on Cebuano literature. I mean, they had to go to the field to collect the materials because the library did not collect Cebuano materials. So I embarked on a project to collect these materials, traveled to Mindanao and so on, just places where I could still find like Cebuano manuscripts, old newspapers, books, and so on. So we built up the start of a Cebuano collection. And the director of research at the time, Father Joseph Gertz, who was in a sense the one who was funding this collections project, kind of, I think, liked it so much that he said, why don't we create a separate kind of library for Cebuano materials? Because we had like kind of built up a collection, and asked me to do a concept paper of what a center or library would be like. So I did, and so that was how the Cebuano Studies Center came to be established in 1975. So I think the important thing is that to see it in relation to what was kind of a real kind of movement at the time, evident in literature and in history, because that was also the year, and I was actively involved in the National Conference on Local History, which started around that time and in fact continues to exist today. It's a long-running annual conference, and so I was actively involved in it. In fact, I think I probably am the only person who attended the first 7 conferences, the first 7 years. And it was, what was interesting about it and indicative of how there was a lot of enthusiasm for local studies was that it was actually carried out by just an ad hoc collection of individuals. and mostly out of Visayas, Mindanao. You know, the first one was done in Cagayan de Oro, and then went to Bacolod, and then went to Tacloban, came to Cebu. And so it really started in Visayas and Mindanao by a group of scholars interested in local history, with, in a sense, the guidance, as it were, of older scholars at that time, like the ones who were actively involved in it from the very start were E. Arsenio Manuel, William Henry Scott, Marcelino Foronda. But they were the elders, but in a sense, the conference itself was sustained by just a group. It was not under the auspices of a university or an organization. It just existed from year to year, and the interest was sustained because there was a great deal of excitement in local historical studies. That's why, one thing that I've suggested, which I think is important, is like some kind of conference to take stock of, what happened to the local studies movement, because it's still here, but it appears that you need to re-energize it because kind of, in fact, I stopped attending it after the 7th year, and then some years later I was invited to keynote local studies conference in Tacloban, I still remember. And I said, in my keynote, said about, I had attended the first 7 years of this conference, and then I stopped attending. And I said that the reason why I stopped attending was that it was getting to be a case of more of the same, in the sense, like, kind of, now it's another town, another province, history of this, history of that. So I was saying that there was a need to recharge the movement, because I think it was getting to be kind of repetitive. So that, I think, is a major intellectual, because if you look back on Philippine literary history, when did you have the first flourishing of interest in, say, vernacular literature? It was the turn of the 20th century, Kind of, this was the so-called golden age of vernacular literature, was the period from roughly 1900 to 1930, and then it started to decline after that. That was the golden age. So that was an important period in Philippine literature. And the reason why we had that golden age was because, of course, Spanish had declined as a prestige language. English was still in the process of being introduced. And I guess in the context of nation building, there was a lot of interest in studying what was kind of Filipino and local. And then, so if that was the golden age, what was the time when kind of a revival of that happened? The long 1970s, is that right? That was, in a sense, also what became a vigorous period in local vernacular studies. And you must remember that, and this is something that's important in Philippine intellectual history, that this was happening across the arts. And I was talking to Ryan Cayabyab recently, because I did an interview of him for the Ramon Magsaysay Awards Foundation. And he pointed out that the kind of rise of OPM, original Filipino music, kind of happened side by side with the rise of independent Philippine cinema. That was also the kind of the exciting time when kind of, Lino Broca, a really exciting period for cinema in the Philippines. At the same time that this was happening also in the field of music and the other arts, and in scholarship, in history and literature. So it's interesting. What was it about the long 1970s that made it one of the most productive period in both the arts and in the intellectual life of the country? It's interesting that the so-called long 1970s, the way Vince Rafael defined it, is this 1975 to 1986. Oh no, 1965 to 1986, coinciding with that time when Marcos was president. 1965 to 1986. That's the long 1970s. And it's kind of a convenient way of thinking of that period. And so that I think people today talk about the martial law period, kind of the dark age in Philippine history, and kind of, which is true in many ways. But I think we should not also overlook, which we don't kind of, in a sense, if it is related to martial law and Marcos, it's probably in a more negative way than positive, meaning as a reaction to authoritarianism, which kind of, in a sense, kept the creative juices of people kind of flowing. I mean, there's nothing like a crisis to make people kind of, when everything is all right, that's when you fall asleep and become lazy. So it was an intellectually challenging time, and that was made it so creative and productive, and it's a real groundswell of creativity, because kind of like Ryan Cayabyab, when we're talking about OPM, was not really aware that was also happening in cinema. It was only when I mentioned it that he kind of said, yeah, that's right. Because these were all independent, ground level initiatives. Many of the interesting things happening in the arts during the Marcos period was connected to government, but much of it was completely autonomous and independent, isn't it right? So that I think is kind of an exciting time. So kind of from the golden age of the early 20th century, and then the long 1970s. So it's interesting as to what will come out of it. So what happened was of course, I got involved in the politics of the period. And I was kind of a journalist when martial law was declared. So I was journalist. I was teaching already at the same time that I was moonlighting as a columnist for a local paper. And so I was detained when martial law was declared, stayed in detention for, actually, in retrospect, a very short period of time, 2.5 months, in fact, when I'm asked as to why I was in for a relatively short period of time, I said, the explanation is that I was not guilty enough. So anyway, the first effect of martial law, and kind of in a sense, martial law was important to my
Your political
my story, because when I was released, after 2.5 months in detention, the practice then was that you don't usually get absolute, what they call absolute release. Usually it's a conditional release. And my status when I was released was I was under provincial arrest. It's partly the military bureaucracy. I don't know exactly why they do that. They were just, I suppose, being careful they don't release you completely. That you have to So I was under provincial arrest, and which meant that I can't leave the province without notifying the military authorities that I'm leaving and getting the permission. And then I have to notify, because I did that once, I have to notify the military authorities at my destination to say I'm here. But anyway, and then after like, I think a few months, I was kind of, because part also of the conditional release is that you have to go to the military camp every week to sign a logbook just to indicate that you're still around, that you have not disappeared. So you have to kind of sign a logbook. So I was doing it, that I can't recall now how long, but not too long, like probably for something like 3 months. And then I was told that I don't have to come anymore. So I thought that was it. And so that was when around that time that I went to UP for my studies, for my doctoral studies, which is another story in itself, because I was not really too keen about, not really seriously thinking about doing a PhD, but I was offered, in a sense, scholarships for Ford Foundation to do my PhD in, to work for a doctorate. And so but it was a great program that did not last very long. It was a Ford Foundation program that I think lasted only several years, because in a way it was ahead of its times, because the idea of the fellowship, it was called Ford Foundation Graduate Training Fellowship in Southeast Asian Studies, was to get Southeast Asians to study each other instead of going to America or going to England. That means it required a Filipino to do work on Indonesia or Thailand and so on. Because in a sense, practically no one was doing that, you know. If you, like the Malaysians went to England for their postdoctoral or doctoral studies, the Indonesians went to the Netherlands, and the Filipinos went to the US. So that's kind of, I mean, who would think of going to Vietnam in order to do your doctoral work? Apart from, of course, the problem of language. But anyway, the whole idea of that fellowship was to build Southeast Asian studies by Southeast Asians, get them to study each other's countries. It was a great program. So since that was the nature of the program, I kind of I applied and said that I was going to do Indonesia. And in a sense, it's kind of, I'll be doing comparative work on Indonesian and Philippine literature. And my reason for why I chose Indonesia is that although kind of it's kind of a difficult subject, but actually one reason was, although this kind of probably like not too relevant, was that I was already thinking of Indonesia. In fact, I was thinking of Indonesia when I was arrested, when martial law was declared. I mean, for some reason, when I was arrested, I thought of Indonesia, because that was the time when kind of the anti-communist massacre, you know, in Indonesia was taking place. So anyway, I chose Indonesia because it's the most exciting field. I mean, why study English writing in Singapore or Malaysia? And of course, Thailand was out of the question because the language is too difficult. I mean, you have to choose a big subject, and so that's Indonesia. And so I got the fellowship, and I knew. No, wait. One is I did not really want, kind of was not too excited about the fellowship. I did not really want to go out of the country at the time. First, because I knew I may have a problem getting a passport. And second, because I don't know for what reason, but I felt that something interesting was going to happen and I would not be here. And also because of personal reasons, because I was just newly married and my first child was just a year. I kind of got into doctoral studies late because I finished my master's in 1969, but I did not proceed to doctoral studies until, 1975? So I was pretty kind of somehow senior when I did my PhD. And so knowing that kind of I did not really want to go out because that means leaving my family and so on. And so I asked Ford, and the good thing was that the Philippine representative of Ford at the time was Jose Abueva, the UP president. He was a Ford Foundation representative in the Philippines. And so I asked Abueva whether it was all right that I do my coursework in UP, meaning here in the Philippines, and just reserve Indonesia for my field work for my dissertation. Because, and I told him because of the situation, because Marcelo was a few years old, and so and Pepe Abueva knew what the political situation was like, and so he agreed that kind of I do my coursework, although in UP, and then do my field work and language studies afterwards in Jakarta. In fact, I already had an approval from the University of Indonesia in Jakarta to be affiliated with the university, and so on. So in a way, I was just kind of trying to buy time because I did not really want to go. And that's the reason why I went to UP. So did my coursework, and in fact, throughout the time I was in UP, I was really focusing on research on Indonesian literature. Because although my dissertation topic was comparative, the Philippines, I'd have all the time in the world to study. But Indonesia, I'll be there only for a short time. So of course, I focused on studying Indonesia when I was in UP, and took a course in Indonesian language, had a course in modern Indonesian history under Joel Rocamora, and then I finished my 3 semesters, because you only need 3 semesters of full-time work to finish your the units. And so now I had to kind of think about, now I have to go to Indonesia, and I was not too excited about it. Anyway, that was the kind of, and it was almost like an obligation. So I applied for a passport, and I did not get one. So I remember applying for a passport in Manila, because I was already studying in UP. And so on the day when I was supposed to get my passport, there was on the kind of bulletin board a list. The following people should go see in a sense, the intelligence unit in DFA. So my name was there. So I went to the office, and in fact, a lady officer was the one there, and she said, "Well, according to our records, you're still under provincial." My classification was still under provincial arrest. And I said, "I've been here for almost 2 years studying in UP. I was not aware that," because I thought, I was told that, it's okay. So I had no, and she said, "But you had to apply for an absolute release." So in a sense, it was kind of technically bureaucratic, that was still my classification in the records. So so I can't qualify for a passport. I have to apply for an absolute release. And the thing was, I was rather kind of relieved, because then it meant that I need not leave the Philippines. So I wrote to, again, Pepe Abueva, and said that, "Well, this is the situation. I can't leave for Indonesia because I can't travel." And he said, whether it's all right if I drop all Indonesia altogether, although that in fact was against the whole idea of the fellowship. And Pepe Abueva said, yeah, so he kind of approved it, he agreed that kind of given the situation and so on. So I dropped Indonesia and just focused on the Philippines, and that resulted in my book, Origins and Rise of the Filipino Novel, which kind of, I think I finished relatively quickly, but could have finished even sooner if it were not for the fact that all the time I was in UP, I was not working on Philippine literature, I was working on Indonesian literature. So I kind of finished it, and in fact, the interesting story about the dissertation was that I got a PhD in literature, which was a new program in UP, and I think a program that did not last very long, because I know of only other people who had a PhD in literature. That was it was a relatively new field, and Damiana Eugenio was my program advisor and also my thesis advisor, and the first time she saw I'm not sure whether I told her I'm working on the Filipino novel, because I never really conferred with her. And I think the first time she saw my dissertation was when I submitted a complete copy already, which I did also with my master's thesis in San Carlos. The first time my advisor saw it and knew what I was working on was when I submitted the copy for oral defense. Because I kind of had a kind of, in a sense, kind of vain idea that I'm the one studying the subject. I mean, I know it better than my I know it better than my advisor, so kind of did not waste my time having to consult it. So anyway, kind of, and so I submitted my completely finished dissertation, and in those days you have to kind of mimeograph copies myself, kind of worked on producing a stencil in order to get it mimeographed. So I did it in kind of the actual typing and so on. I did myself, and kind of I wanted to finish everything in one visit to Manila. So I decided I was going to do my 2 language exams and my oral defense on the same day, so that I can come in from Cebu, get everything finished, and then return to Cebu. And so I arranged my language exams with the teachers, and it turned out that the 2 I had Spanish and Bahasa Indonesia were scheduled exactly on the same hour. But I did not want to have to make for a change of schedule. Decided I was going to do it together. And the good thing was, the convenient thing which made it possible was that for Indonesia, I did it I can't remember the faculty member who was in the faculty center. And in another office, I did Spanish. And both faculty members were, of course, not there. They just left me in the office. So I'd go from one office, work on my Spanish, and then kind of go up to work on the Indonesian, come back and finished everything. And when I finished both exams, I just had enough time to get a quick lunch and go to my oral defense. So I finished everything in just finished everything in just one day. And I don't recall that there was any, it was not a long defense. Lebian Lobera, I think was one, Pete Daroy, and I don't recall there was any suggestion for any change. So what I submitted that was it. And the next thing I knew, some months or I don't remember, a year later, I was told that UP was going to publish it. But I never submitted it to UP. It was Eugenio who submitted my dissertation to UP. Of course, I had no objection. They're going to publish it. And they published it. So although I did not actually, was not the one who submitted it for publication. And so that turned out all right. And I think the significance of origins and rise of the Filipino novel, in addition to the fact that it's still something that is useful today, is that I think it's a rather rare work to do a kind of a trans-regional study of the novel, meaning to attempt to do a study of the Filipino novel that includes not just, but in as many languages as I can manage, because it of course deals with Spanish, English, because it goes up to 1940, Tagalog, Cebuano. I took up a few Hiligaynon. I mean, and then for the others like Kapampangan and Ilocano or Bicol, which of course I cannot manage, to at least use what translations may be available. But it was an ambitious attempt to do a study of the Filipino novel that encompasses texts in as many languages as possible. So I think that I think is the significance of the work, because even today, and I've been urging that, like, an important need today is for cross-regional studies. I mean, it's still very rare to find a scholar who studies 2 or 3 different, languages. That's still rather rare. Meaning, people study their own language instead of, and I think there's a need for, like, if you're going to build kind of a body of kind of Philippine writing, it has to kind of involve kind of cross-regional studies. That's why, like, it's important. That's an important direction for Philippine literary research to take. You know? When I was starting out to write, like, or become interested in writing, say early 60s, probably as early as 1950s. For somebody in a sense of my background, middle class, both my parents were public school teachers and so on. Like, I recall being asked by an American professor some years back, and he said, and his question was, which kind of took me by surprise, because I had never been really asked that question before, and said, why did you decide to write in English instead of the local language? And kind of I thought about it. I said, thinking about, like, when I was in high school and had thoughts of doing kind of serious writing, said, I was not aware that there was a choice. I mean, that there was a choice, because kind of the nature of education and intellectual formation at the time was that if you wanted to be a serious writer, that means you write in English, because still there was that kind of clear divide between what was popular and what was, high and low culture, and kind of, I mean, your education almost completely in English, and you have parents who are public school teachers and so on. Kind of, I was exposed to Cebuano. Of course, Cebuano was the language we spoke at home. Although the strange thing that, like, when occasion that you have to write letters to your parents, you never write in Cebuano, you write in English. I think the one reason why you write in English is because and if you write in the home language like Cebuano kind of seem like you kind of expose yourself too much, where it's too intimate, whereas English has a distancing effect. I mean, you like kind of like Cebuano would seem like mawkish and sentimental. You'd be kind of revealing too much of your feelings. So anyway, kind of we spoke Cebuano at home, although kind of usually when the conversation becomes much more kind of, in a sense, intellectual, you kind of shift to English. I listened to radio, opera, soap opera in Cebuano, read Bisaya magazine, but I don't think I ever when I said shall I write? I mean, it's kind of it. That was how you were kind of, in a sense, that kind of, you want to go into kind of, like if you are like a student in high school or a college student, it's almost like kind of a given. That's the language you write in. In fact, like in high school, that was the time when you can't speak the local language in school, you get fined and so on. If you have to bring a copy of Bisaya to school, you kind of hide it because it's embarrassing to be seen reading Bisaya. I mean, that was how it was. So that's why I said, when I think about it, I'm not sure that I was not aware that there was a choice. I mean, it's almost like it was a given that you write in English. I think, like for most Filipinos of my generation and my background, language became a choice again only at the end of the 1960s. That's what I said earlier. That it became aware that you were conscious and in a sense guilty about using English, and that happened only end of the 1960s when language became a problem and a question. Prior to that time, it was,
You didn't feel restricted also using English. You didn't feel restricted using English, sir?
No, you were not really aware of it. Of course, kind of the fact that the use of the English language predisposes you to speaking about life in certain ways and so on. I mean, the thing is, you were not conscious that was kind of problematic. I mean, and then you come to a point when because of your training, you really are more comfortable writing in English than, because to begin with, like Cebuano is a language that even today is not taught in the schools, isn't it right? Meaning, so it's like if you're serious about the language, you have to apply it individually, kind of take the initiative to learn it yourself, because it's not taught, and so that in fact the young writers today, what's admirable about young Cebuano writers is that they have really taken the initiative to learn the language, because they are not prepared for it. I remember when I was still, and I had just established the Cebuano Study Center, and then a young writer came to me and showed me some of his Cebuano poems. And I don't know whether you know him, he's Bob Lim, Robert Pableo Lim. Although he's not active writing anymore, he's into photography. And I think he studied in UP for a time and came to me and wanted me. And I was kind of struck. I was really impressed by his poems. And the reason I was impressed because they were kind of street Cebuano, and you get used to old classical Cebuano text. And this is something that is very youthful, very colloquial, and kind of street Cebuano. And that was, in fact, what made his poetry very fresh. I got excited. And then I met also other young writers who were writing in the same vein. And then I realized that they're writing in that way because that's the only language that they know. Kind of, if they kind of write in that, that's the only Cebuano that they know. No? Kind of the kind of street colloquial Cebuano. And the important change was that later there were young Cebuano writers, people like Butch Bandillo, Mil Baclay, who, in a sense, really work at enlarging their resources in language by studying Cebuano, meaning they were not writing in that way because that's the only language that they know, but they have really kind of expanded their linguistic resources by actually studying Cebuano as a language. Anyway, kind of the point there is that, like for instance, again, an illustrative example, Edilberto Tiempo, the novelist, Ed Tiempo, was here in San Carlos. I was a young teacher then, I think. Anyway, he came here to give a talk. And I still remember what he said. And he said, if you want to write in English, because of course he's a kind of a writer in English, he says, if you want to write in English well, you have to think in English, feel in English, and dream in English. And that was what Ed Tiempo said. And I'm trying to recall as to what my reaction was at that time, but I probably felt that kind of just said, that makes good sense, isn't that right? Meaning if you want to be like write really fluent English, that made perfect sense. It was only sometime later I realized, like, if you think in English and feel and dream in English, then what have you become? Is that right? Kind of. So, but at the time I was not you're not really conscious that, that you're writing in English is a problem. It's only kind of, later. Kind of martial law is an important factor there. I started out writing short stories,
Beast in the field. Beast in the field.
Published probably a dozen stories. So like for the space of a few years, it was very productive. Kind of like in Free Press, there were years that I published like 2 or 3 stories in 1 year, which is and in fact I kind of the problem there was that I was writing too much too soon. And anyway, the last story I wrote was a story that I finished on the eve of martial law. And I was about to submit it for publication, and then martial law was declared. So the story never got published until published only after 1986. So it was a story that I finished in about 1972, and then because of martial law, of course I could not publish it. It was published only in ANI of the Cultural Center of the Philippines. This was after 1986, and that was the last story. So it was a case where I just, how would you call it, got derailed. Meaning, and the situation then was, one is, technically, perhaps it's not a complete excuse, but the situation then was, if you are a detainee and then you get released, as I said, it's a conditional release. And among the conditions for the release would be like, for instance, you cannot give a press interview and you cannot publish. That's kind of part of the condition. You're not restriction you're being able to publish. So, but I don't think that was really the primary reason, because I don't know how strictly that was enforced. But the other reason was that there were nowhere to publish. Like in martial law, for much of the early period of martial law, the only outlet for like, if you're, for instance, publishing a short story in English was focus. And there was the unwritten understanding among writers. I mean, that was what I felt at the time, that you don't publish in focus because it's a crony paper, you understand, right? Kind of. So it's almost like you are, in a way, like kind of you satisfy your inactivity by saying that it's a form of protest against you don't publish, and you don't publish in a periodical like Focus. So there was nowhere to publish. But I think the more important reason is I just kind of I just got derailed, meaning like I became more involved in other things, and became involved in like in scholarly and academic writing, and I think a reason why that I really kind of went into scholarly work is that I recall again Nick Joaquin. Actually, the first rejection, in a sense, the first and only rejection slip that I got was from Nick, and which shows that kind of Nick is she's a good editor, you know. I mean, like, and of course, I was one of those kind of regarded like kind of Nick's boys, you know, kind of Erwin Castillo, Wilfredo Pascua Sanchez, kind of the young writers at that time who were kind of looked up to Nick as the king, and Wilfredo Noliedo as the prince, and we were kind of, in a sense, the kind of page boys or whatever you could call it, say Cripioson and so on. And so kind of Nick was really, in a sense, kind of the patron of young writers at the time. And Nick kind of published it, but they got to a point where Nick rejected a story of mine and had a note which said, I can't remember now exactly. I mean, that's a note that I should have had, but anyway, I think I probably lost it. Where I don't know exactly what he said, but the tenor of what he said was that to the effect that I was just going through the motions, like I was not really. I didn't really have anything more to say. It was just kind of I was repeating myself and trying to rely on a lot of kind of fancy language footwork to cover the fact that actually, if you look at the story, there's really not much in it. It's just all kind of, and when you think about it, he was perfectly right. And so I suppose that was part of my motivation to go into research and scholars, because kind of the thing that, and this is I think what young writers need to learn also, is that what do you really know? I mean, from which you can draw in terms of for your writing. Meaning you have to. I mean, either you kind of widen your personal experience of life, but often you don't really have opportunities or occasions to do that, or you really study and read a lot. You know, right? Okay, those are the two ways in which you can, in a sense, build your imaginative resources, as it is, and so I think that was part of the passion that I had with respect to learning. And of course, one problem there is often you can go too far, where like kind of you find such joy in learning that you don't get to the point when you start writing. I mean, I have a friend, for instance, who's a great researcher. I mean, he's really a great researcher, and he so enjoys research that he does not get to the point where he writes and publishes, because the research itself is what kind of excites him. So I mean, that's true of kind of, I suppose, you have to know when you need to start writing and so on. But so that's kind of, so the last short story I wrote was that one that I wrote in 1972, and after that I had from time to time thought that of the need to like get back into literary work, and so in fact I made two attempts. Yeah, I think two attempts when I actually started writing a novel, but abandoned it very quickly because kind of I realized that, I mean, I just could not summon the appetite to write. Meaning like I feel that like writing is something that you have to feel strongly the urge to do it, and not just, or otherwise you're just, like going through the motions. I mean, that means you have, and my feeling was that like, it's difficult to shift from like academic or scholarly writing to literary writing because it involves a different kind of attention. Meaning you can just switch on and off, and like if you do like for instance, if I kind of do an academic article, I can probably like do it in snatches and so on. But I have a feeling that if I'm going to do a novel, I have to do. That means I don't think about anything else, but just do it. I mean, you can't like, as I said, you can't turn it. So I could not either find the space or find the appetite to really go back to doing literary work. In fact, I got only as far as like, there's a novel, for instance, that I have in mind that I really want to write, that I have almost kind of fairly a clear idea of like the whole plot and so on. But it's just that I can't find a space to do it because there are other things that kind of interest me, and so on. Like, and so what I said was, I think I told Karina Bolasco this. I said, what I've decided to do. In fact, Karina is after me to publish my short stories, kind of around 12, I think around 12, and it's already typeset, but it has been with me for some years already, but I refuse to work on it. So kind of, I probably Karina has given up because I told her, I said, I'm not too excited about it. So I don't feel like motivated to get it published, because I said, why? I mean, it's already out in print. Anybody interested can go look up an issue of Free Press. Why? So I'm not completely convinced that it's worth putting together as a book and so on. And besides, I said, there are other things I'm more interested in than reading the stories again and finding out. Anyway, I said, so what in a way I've decided to do is to explore the possibility of kind of blurring the boundaries between a scholarly work and a literary work. I mean, why not? I mean, like kind of, one important characteristic of contemporary literature is the blurring of generic boundaries. There are a lot of works that you can't really tell as to what they are, whether they're travel writing, memoir, novel, and so on. In fact, I just finished reading a work of nonfiction by an important contemporary Spanish novelist named Javier Cercas, and he came across a book of his, which is a work of nonfiction. It's actually a biography of it's entitled The Impostor, because it's a biography of a man who kind of pretended what he was not. And well, you would classify it as nonfiction, but Javier Cercas calls it, what did he call it? A novel without fiction. So that's what it is, a novel without fiction. And you have so many kind of what makes, in fact, if you kind of are into contemporary world writing, which I am now, is you're amazed at the works that explode the established boundaries, you know. Like one book that I just finished reading, which I like, is there's a South African writer. He's primarily a novelist, Ivan Vladislavich. He's a South African, but kind of a Russian name. Anyway, he has a book entitled The Lost Library. Lost, L-O-S-S, The Lost Library. And what he has done is that he apparently is the kind of writer who keeps diligent about keeping a journal where he has story ideas, research notes, and so on. So he has kind of this journal running for something like 20 years. And he selected the most interesting items there to come up with a series of essays on short stories that he never finished. You know, short stories that he thought of writing but never got around to writing, or kind of he already had his story ideas, research notes, and so on, but he never got around to finishing it. And so that's why it's called The Lost Library. Very interesting collection, meaning kind of, so you understand, wow, you can write actually a book about stories that you did not finish, you know? Why not, you know? So my idea is that kind of, why can't scholarly work be a literary work at the same time? And that's what I've tried to do in Isabella's archive, and what I'm doing again in a book that I'm writing, meaning to blur the boundary between academic, so-called academic, and literary writing. So there's so many texts today, and some of them, like you read my favorite contemporary writer, W.G. Sebald. You know, he clearly is writing novels, but the first time I met him, I was excited because, you know, and he typically uses photographs in his novels. And I said, you know, is this travelogue, memoir, kind of. And that's why when I was asked in an interview about what kind of books I'm interested in, I said, I'm interested in books that are odd and unclassifiable. Meaning you can't put them in one neat category. And so that's kind of what I want to do, that you don't think in terms of the old classical, you know, poetry, novel, you know, neat categories. After all, kind of, ultimately, it's a matter of good writing and kind of, you know, use of the imagination. I mean, okay. So, in fact, one reason why I was not too comfortable with being named national artist for literature is because it's a question of category, you know, kind of. Because my understanding is that literature, the NCCA defines it rather liberally and broadly, to include even journalism, literary studies, and so on. And so in the past I had kind of objected to it. I said, why kind of water down the category by introducing journalism and literary criticism and so on. But eventually I thought that, well, the good thing about it is that can you get out of the traditional conceptions that what is literature, or what is even like kind of literary has to conform to what the standard genres are, right? You get a writer like the Polish writer, the journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski. I mean, and he does kind of reportage.
And yet, I mean, the way he does the reportage is kind of far superior to books that call themselves novels and short stories. You know, so are you going to say that Ryszard Kapuscinski is not kind of not a literary person because he does journalistic reportage instead of writing a novel or writing a short story? So, as I said, the most interesting thing about contemporary writing in the world today is that there's so many works that kind of exceed or break out of kind of what the conventional generic distinctions are. The thing there is that, and I have an amusing story. UP, they had a conference, the College of Music, and the dean is a good friend of mine because he's Cebuano, si Jojo Buen Consejo. And he had a conference and invited me to be one of the speakers in music. So I'm kind of, in a sense, like fascinated with the idea of doing papers on topics that I know next to nothing about. So I said, so I said I was going to do a paper because I had already done a short paper. So that was what I presented. So they were going to publish it, the collection of the papers at that conference, and including the one that I did. And then I got a note from Jojo Buen Consejo conveying the reader's report on because it was a refereed publication. So there was a reader's report, and the reader's comments about my article was that something about, which I kind of found kind of amusing, was that kind of one is that I don't state the problem clearly at the beginning of the article. You know, kind of the conventions of doing a scholarly article. Yeah, there's no clear statement of the problem and something about the way the article is presented. Kind of really a standard critique of based on what the conventions are for. And so I wrote back to Jojo Buen Consejo and said, no, I don't want to revise the article. He said, it's perfectly all right with me that if you don't use it, because I know that kind of, you publish a book, the article may be, so far as you're good, but it does not fit into the kind of the style of the book. So kind of, it's perfectly all right if you don't, I said, if you don't use it. But the reason why it's written in that way, because it's written in a fragmentary fashion, where like instead of sections, these are very short sections that I just number like 1, 2, 3, and so on. So and I said, I can't do the kind of article that is recommended is one is, I'm not an authority on music. I mean, like, to write in that manner would seem like kind of, you know, you're writing like statement of the problem and the conclusions, and so kind of acquiring a certain kind of authoritative kind of form, where I said, I can't write an article like that because I'm not an authority on music. This is just a series of reflections on the subject that I think are useful. And the reason why it's done in a fragmentary fashion is because I can't, you know, like I can't do kind of a seamless, continuous treatise because I don't have the competence. Like I'm kind of misrepresenting myself by taking on the air or sound of like an authority speaking when I'm not. So that's the reason why it's written that way. And Buen Consejo decided that now we're going to use it anyway. So set aside the recommendations of the reader. And so it came out. When I saw it, what happened was that they made certain changes without consulting me. Like they removed the numbering. So if you read it, kind of seems like a very kind of instead of like, in a sense, a series of short, it kind of makes it rather difficult to read because it like kind of, there are no transitions from one, because the numbers are removed. I would like to be involved in it, but often like kind of, you just kind of, there's a new edition of House of Memory, which came out. And since that's kind of an old book, and I think this was the time before, so I don't have a digital copy of the original. So they decided to kind of manually re-encode the whole text. And then the next thing I knew, they were already going to press because they were apparently there was a deadline. They had a certain deadline to meet. So I wrote to the one who was handling the book. I said that they had not, kind of sent me for my proofreading because I'd like to proofread my own work. And she apologized, as she said, and she acknowledged it was her fault because I said since it was not taken from a digital copy but was manual, that means there may be errors in it in the encoding. That I would have wanted to go through it just to check, and she assured me that kind of they had proofreaders really go through it, and so I did not insist. I did not want to cause her any problems about delaying the publication because I want to see it for myself. So I just said, and usually in those cases, I don't read the books that when they come out in print because I'm afraid I'm going to come across something that kind of needed correction. So I kind of, and that the story of that article on music, that's an important kind of intervention in the text that I would have I would have insisted on following the original format. And it's a case of an editor who just doesn't really read the text, isn't it right? It's an editor who does not really read the text, but just works with the assumption that like numbering the sections is not the proper format. So it shows that also that kind of you need certain conventions are important, but you don't have to be trapped within those conventions. When Isabella's archive was launched in Ateneo, because it coincided with a summer institute that was participated in by, actually it was a great program, but lasted only a few years because it was too expensive for Ateneo to sustain. But this was a doctoral dissertation workshop where they invited like students already working on their dissertations in the U.S. So it was not working on Philippine topics. So it was an international workshop, and so the launching of Isabella's archive coincided with that, and so they were all there, the participants in the workshop. And so I started by saying, "This is not a book that you're going to write, kind of, because they're writing in a dissertation." And you have to get your PhD, so you have to follow all the conventions. It's it's a privilege of somebody who's already senior, doesn't really care about getting credits for that. You're free to write in whatever way you. So you have to probably you get tenured, and you get then you don't have to follow those conventions, but you have to be somebody like in history, for instance, a really eminent historian like Jonathan Spence, who writes in a kind of style of like kind of, it says a popular narrative, and yet he's of course, I mean, he can get away with it because of his stature as a historian. But the ones who are starting out, if they have to write a dissertation, they have to stick closely to what a dissertation should be. I suppose the broadest sense of the word political, I mean, it's, I think, something that cannot be avoided, you know, kind of. I think one book that had an influence of me when I was kind of martial law period or around that time is Jean-Paul Sartre's What is Literature? I'm not sure whether that's the title of the book. And I recall that there's some part in it where he said something about when you're writing, and of course, kind of for something to be read by other people, like if I, for instance, like tell you, I mean, draw your attention from the shelves, you know, kind of, in a sense, kind of, I give it a certain kind of importance, and everything else fades into the background. And so that in itself is political. Why is this important instead of that? You know, I mean, kind of, it's a way of kind of, but if you speak about something, I mean, you're like drawing the reader's attention to this as something that he should attend to. But why this instead of? So even like the choice of what to write about. So in that most basic of ideas, I mean, it's politics is already involved, you know. I mean, like there's a lot of things you can write about. Why this instead of that? You know, I mean, like so you may not be fully conscious of it, but the choices you make, even when you decide on like what it is that you will write about, is already inextricably kind of political.
Apparently, there was the idea, but they did not really pursue it. Parang it was just to get parang business establishments. I don't mind mention this to you, which I think is a great idea. It should be to get business establishments to adopt a writer in residence. So and so they were telling me they were thinking of like say Figaro, and that they were thinking that I'd be the person who should be a writer in residence Figaro, because they know that I do my writing in coffee shops. Wow. So
Coffee
so I
shop
said,
scholars.
yeah, that's a great idea. I said, you can like, because yung writer in residence, I mean, doesn't have to be interpreted literally. It's just that you have an institutional sponsor. I don't know exactly what comes with that title, but it can vary depending. So I was saying like, so I was suggesting now like, you can get Casino Filipino to adopt a writer in residence. You go, I already have a recommendation.
Wow.
Si Butch Dalisay. So, kasi I got that idea from this writer Alain de Botton. He does non-fiction, and I came across him. In fact, I think I have his book here. And then he was writer in residence of Heathrow International Airport.
Heathrow.
No, sa London. So ito, the airport having a writer in residence.
Oh, writers writing at the airports.
No, parang just, in this case, I think part of the package was that he would write a book about airports.
Oh, ganda.
So
in exchange for
in exchange for, I don't know what else came with the title.
Maganda po yun.
But it's a sponsorship. So he wrote a book, maliit lang na libro, A Week at the Airport. Parang a whole week just describing what goes on in an airport. So, and then Alain de Botton decided to set up a fund for creative nonfiction.
Wow.
And so they for creative nonfiction, using the same concept. So the last time I looked, they had a writer who was writer in residence of the largest aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, and he lived in the carrier for I think a month to write a book about it. And then my writer in residence a World Bank.
Wow.
So he wrote
Wow,
parang
the bank.
what goes on in the headquarters of
Magandang idea po
World
yan.
Bank. So I was saying na parang all it takes is somebody in the Philippines to pick up the idea.
Oh, like you.
Kasi yung kwan is, like if you get for instance, say Figaro, they have a writer in residence, so they want benefit from some publicity na support for the arts, and then in exchange, it can be as simple as, it depends sa what you can get out of them. Na parang if your writer in residence will have free coffee and sandwiches every time he goes there. I mean, what does it cost the coffee shop, di ba? So
Baliwala lang.
bali wala. They get
Promotion.
promotion. So and you can do that for the other, which means that any establishment in the Philippines, Tanduay or can have a writer in residence.
In your case, a boytist. Di ba yung mga books niyo about...
Oh, and any business establishment can have a writer in residence. I mean, if magaling ka sa promotion, and especially if it's government that initiates it, I mean, who would say no? It does, what? I mean, yung parang money involved is, di ba? Even if you parang, if the company is, gives a monthly stipend, but even then it doesn't amount to much. So yun ang parang ang idea sa yung kay Alain de Botton na he has a special fund for you to apply. You have a book project, and then so okay yun sa in fact, we had a proposal once, except na against the NCCA when I was in the committee, na we're thinking na something that would be easy to sell because it doesn't cost much. Na parang writer in residence. Pero ang target are resort hotels.
Wow.
And then to get them to sponsor for free a writer to stay in the hotel.
Okay, that word.
But we know na parang it will not be a parang problem for the hotel. 1 week lang.
1 week lang.
So the hotel provides room and free breakfast, as is customary, for say 10 days.
Wow.
And then ang NCCA pays for the writer's travel from his place of residence to the hotel, wherever the hotel, where you have hotel, yes, plus some pocket money, spending money. So, both on the part of NCCA as well as the participating hotel, what does it involve in terms of budget, di ba? I mean, the hotel can even specify parang yung low traffic season.
During that time.
During that time, they'll be available only on these months.
Hindi yung
So it
peak
does not
season.
interfere with their business kasi empty yung room, even go to the
Plus yung CSR nila, corporate social responsibility.
corporate social responsibility, support for Philippine arts.
Diba?
Ganun. So parang may
For tax deduction.
and yet in terms of like actual financial
Wala.
outlay, practically wala.
And that was Dr. Resil Mojares, truly one of the most brilliant minds our country is blessed with, and to whom writers of future generations, both creative and scholarly, owe a great debt. Daghang salamat.
In early 1990s, I was doing a weekly column for a Cebu City magazine. This was a magazine entitled Weekend, which is the Sunday supplement of Sunstar Daily. And so the column takes the form of very short essays. So I did this series of short essays weekly for a number of years. So I'm reading one of the essays in that series, which a selection of these essays came out in a collection entitled House of Memory. And so what I'm going to read comes from this collection. As a column, kind of, there were times when I had to write like occasional essays. Like in this case, it was Valentine's Day. And so that's the subject of the essay, entitled Heart and Liver. How did it come to pass that we should love with our heart instead of the liver? The pre-colonial Filipino, like many of his contemporaries in Southeast Asia, believed that the liver is the seat of love. And more, it is the bodily center of a person's being, the source of his power, courage, and strength. It is named in Philippine languages, atay, ate, hatay, ati, and hati, as in Malay. And it has spawned numerous derivations that signify what is treasured, affective, and elemental. In Tagalog, emotion is dalamhati, literally inside the liver. An intense of feelings of grief, yearning, and happiness are pighati, lunggati, and luwalhati. Metaphorically, the word atay is used to refer to the best of everything, so that the most fertile land is atay ng lupa, or the liver of the land, and the softest, most feeling part of the hand or leg is atay ng paa, the liver of the leg, or in Cebuano, atay-atay. In Old Tagalog, a proud and powerful man is called pagmamay-atay, or he who claims to have the liver. In Cebuano, one speaks of glowing praise as makapadako sa atay, that which enlarges the liver, and of what causes a sharp, rending emotion as makapakitbi sa atay, meaning that which curdles the liver. So elemental is the liver that among the Bagobo, Manobo, and Mandaya in early Mindanao, one eats a piece of an enemy's liver to gain his power and enhance one's strength. The aswang, or witch of local lore, knows what the best body part is and aims straight for the liver, which is the body's bloodiest organ, instead of the heart. Such native knowledge is not peculiar to Filipinos, but found among early peoples in other parts of the world. Ancient medical theorists, like the 2nd century Greek physician Galen, ascribed to the liver great powers, both physiological and mystical. It is then no surprise that our own native expressions have equivalents in many other languages. In contrast, the mythology of the heart
is not as attractive, nor is its chemistry as complex. The most versatile organ, the liver, has some 200 different functions. It manufactures bile, removes poisons, processes nourishing sugars, forms antibodies, purifies the blood, enhances its flow, and more. It has amazing recuperative powers, for when a part of it is damaged, it can grow new cells to replace lost ones. If there is a chemistry to love, there is no better place for it than this wonderful chemical capital of the body, the liver. Beside it, the heart is a rather dull organ. I'm sure all this is not convincing anyone to barter the heart for the liver. I don't expect anyone would be sending a Valentine's Day card with a drawing of the liver instead of the heart. The merchandising possibilities do not look attractive. Jaundice yellow instead of the signature red, and instead of Cupid shooting arrows into a heart, perhaps a witch or sorcerer digging in for the liver. And I have to admit, it does not sound romantic to speak of one love-struck as giatay, though come to think of it, being struck by pestilence, which is what giatay means, is not at all an inaccurate metaphor for love. We have come to fancy the simpler, softer, sanitary imagery of the heart, yet turning away from the more darkly visceral symbolism of the liver, we may have missed out on the denser, earthier, more dangerous, and labyrinthine qualities of love. Your hallmark messages of a tame and prettified love do not quite grab the heart, or I mean the liver, as this old Palawanon verse about what some young man had ardently inscribed. On the areca tree by the wayside, I etched a sign, my liver hungers for you.